It's all about Jesus, his sinless life as both fully God and fully man, his death on a cross, and his resurrection that triumphed over death forever. But how does the gospel speak to issues like justice, adoption, disability, gratitude, growth, and generosity? How do we act in line with the truth of the gospel? How are we following the gospel line?
Well, good morning, NorthPoint. Good to see you this morning. And man, good just to be able to celebrate baptism. We got a couple in the second service that are going to take place, and great to celebrate with Ron. If you see him out in the foyer today after the service, encourage him and come alongside of him. We're thankful for his story. We're going to jump into the new series today. I want to ask you this. How many of you love confrontation? Like, you just live for it. You wake up in the morning thinking, who can I set right in this day and make sure everything is just the way it's supposed to be? Probably not many of us, right? Not many of us are probably like, yeah, I'm just looking for confrontation. I hope that happens today. I deal with a good amount of confrontation in the work that I do, but I don't like it. I don't like it at all. In fact, if I'm out at a restaurant and like the waiter brings me the wrong drink, I may not tell them that they brought me the wrong drink just to avoid any awkwardness. I like to order everything online. I don't like to talk on the phone. Sometimes my wife is like, we could have had that ordered like 20 minutes ago if you would just make a phone call. But I was like, no, I'm downloading the app. I'm going to sign up for the rewards. I'm going to do it so I don't have to, I could just avoid any awkwardness or confrontation that might come by having to talk with someone. Have you ever watched a confrontation take place before? That's always a mix, isn't it? It's like a mix of awkwardness and you feel kind of uneasy about it, but at the same time, you're kind of intrigued, like, are they just going to throw down right now? How far is this thing going to go? And so maybe you've seen that happen before at like a sporting event or at your workplace or in some type of social setting. What I want you to do today is to kind of get that confrontation feeling, what it feels like to see or to be a part of a confrontation, and imagine what it would have been like to see the two main leaders of the early church going at it with each other. Peter and Paul have this happen in the early church. Two guys that Jesus entrusted with his message and entrusted his church with get into a major confrontation. Now, you may know this, but if not, the apostle Peter is like the apostle to the Jewish people. So he's like the main leader at the church in Jerusalem after Jesus ascends back up into heaven. On the day of Pentecost, he preaches. This is found in Acts chapter 2. And 3,000 people trust in Jesus, and the church is born, and it grows, and everything's going well, really under Peter and other apostles. But Peter's like the main one, his leadership. Paul comes along a little bit while later, converts to Christianity, and he becomes the apostle to the Gentiles, and he plants churches all over the Roman world, really outside of Israel and Jerusalem. So we've got like Peter to the Jews and Paul to the Gentiles, and these are like the pillars of the early church. Now, we know their past. We know that Peter used to be a loudmouth who denied Jesus, always would give his opinion. Often it was not exactly right, and Jesus would correct it, right? But that was Peter. And then Paul actually killed Christians at first. He was named or known by Saul, and he killed Christians. He wants to stamp out Christianity. Jesus meets him, says, you're on my team now. He converts to Christianity. And then from there, both of these guys, after Jesus gets a hold of them, they really transform the world through their influence. And so the way that we think of them, before Jesus, but then after Jesus is like they're holy. They wrote the Bible. They're highly esteemed. You even get the idea when you think about them after Jesus that like everything they did was absolutely right and correct. I mean, down to this day, thousands of churches are named after them. Thousands of churches in the world. We actually have one of them here in Johnston. The Presbyterian Church in Johnston is St. Paul's Presbyterian Church. The most famous Roman church in the entire world is named after Peter, St. Peter's Basilica in the Vatican City in Rome, right? So these guys, Paul and Peter, are like the Mount Rushmore, all-pro saints, second only to Jesus, and they just throw down. Could you imagine being a part of the early church and watching this thing happen? What do you think your response would be to watching Peter and Paul go at it? It maybe be like a little bit like this. Would this be your response? You'd be like, oh, what is happening? Or maybe this one. Maybe, oh, I don't know what's going on here. Or maybe it would be this response. I can't believe this. Or maybe for some of you, just be like, you do this emoji, right? This like, I don't want to see this. What is happening here? Get me away from this. Okay, that's for the kids this morning. So, okay, what actually happened though? What would cause a confrontation like that? And that we find in Galatians chapter 2. So if you have a Bible or your device, take it and turn to Galatians chapter 2, page 943, and the Bible is there in front of you. And we're going to take a look at what would cause this confrontation. First, I want you to see it, how it's described by Paul. Paul's writing this letter to churches in Galatia. And the churches in Galatia, that's going to be the context of the confrontation. You notice it in Galatians chapter 2 and verse 11. Paul says this, when Cephas came to Antioch. Now, I got to pause immediately because you're like, I thought we were talking about Peter and Paul. Who is this Cephas guy? Well, if we would go back in the story, we find out that Peter's given name was actually, does anybody know? His given name was actually Simon. That was his birth name. When Jesus meets him, Jesus liked to give nicknames to people sometimes. And so he gave Simon a nickname, and he said, you're going to be named Stone or Rock. Now, in Greek, stone or rock is Peter, but the common language of the day that commoners spoke was actually Aramaic. And in Aramaic, rock or stone is Cephas. So Cephas or Peter, stone, rock, this is Simon, Peter, Cephas. He had multiple names. It's kind of like your dogs. Like if you have a dog, and you give your dog a name, it has one name, but you have multiple variations of that same name of the dog. Do you know this, the dog owners? You know what I'm talking? No? Okay, whatever. Okay, that just came to my mind. So anyways, Cephas is Peter. Long way to say that. Okay, when Cephas came to Antioch. Now, Antioch is a church that was a big deal for Paul. Paul didn't plant the church at Antioch, but that's where he did his first leadership. And he with Barnabas were at Antioch. This is Syrian Antioch for over a year, pastoring, shepherding, leading that church. It's at Antioch that God called out Paul and Barnabas to be the missionary church planters for the Roman world. And they go out from Antioch to plant all of these churches. And so this is like Paul's like home base, the church of Antioch. Peter comes to Antioch, and it says, when Peter came to Antioch, Paul says, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. There it is. And it's strong. I opposed him to his face. I did it publicly because he stood condemned. So this isn't just from Paul to Peter, like, hey, did you kind of got something on your face? Or, hey, can I just talk to you about something, a little thing I just need to talk to you about privately? This is full-on rebuke in front of other people. So other people would have been watching this happen. And if you would have been there, you would have been doing one of those 4 emoji things, watching what's happening and taking place. What is going on right now? Now, this is well into Peter and Paul's full-on saint mode. So this is not early on. This is probably about 15 years after Jesus is ascended back up into heaven. Paul has planted churches. Everybody thinks that Peter's such a great guy leading the church. So why such a strong confrontation from Paul to Peter? What do you think might have been going on? In our day, we would say, well, has to be a sex scandal, right? Peter's caught up in something like that, or he's stolen money from a lot of people, or he has a secret life. And like Paul realized that Peter's got a secret life going on where he's taking advantage of other people, or he's doing something illegal. And so he needs to expose what's going on with Peter. Well, let's see what it was. Verse number 12. For before certain men came from James, Peter used to eat with the Gentiles. But when they arrived, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles because he was afraid of those who belonged to the circumcision group. Okay, lots of things going on there. But who is this circumcision group? Because they're identified as this group of people that come from James. Now, if Peter was like a main leader at the church in Jerusalem, James was like the lead pastor of the church in Jerusalem, okay? And so from James, it says this group came from the Jerusalem church, and this group that came from them was known as the circumcision party, or the circumcision group. So who is that? Well, they were a group of Jews that taught that Gentiles had to follow Judaism, the Jewish Old Testament laws, in order to be a Christian. So in order for you to be a follower of Jesus, yeah, you trust in Jesus, but you have to be, if you're a male, you got to be circumcised like Jews are circumcised. That was their big deal. And you got to follow the Jewish dietary laws, certain things you can eat and you can't eat. And you got to follow the rituals of the Jews if you're really going to be in with God. That was this group. And when this group comes to Antioch, Peter caves into them. He's afraid of them, it says, and he's afraid of their influence, so he stops associating with Gentile Christians. Before they came, he would eat food with them, he would associate with them, everything was good, but they come and now he's like, oh, I don't know. I'm fearful of them and what they're gonna say, so he withdraws from eating with Gentiles. And Gentiles are simply non-Jewish people. Now, you can see how influential Peter is in verse 13 when it says this. The other Jews, so probably Jews that are a part of the Antioch church, they joined him in his hypocrisy, so that by their hypocrisy, even Barnabas was led astray. Up to this point, Barnabas and Paul are tight, man. They are like this. They've gone on missionary journeys together. It was Barnabas that really brought Paul into Christianity and got him to be accepted among the other leaders of the early church. And so they're super tight. And now Paul is like, even Barnabas, my guy, has been pulled into this hypocrisy because of Peter's influence. And so under Peter's influence, all the Jewish believers are saying, you Gentiles are not good enough. We can't associate with you unless you get circumcised and you follow all of the Old Testament rules. And not only that, but you're not even real Christians until you do this thing. Now, have you seen this kind of thing happen before? Have you done this kind of thing before? Oh, you go to that church. Oh, you do that. Oh, you were baptized like that. Probably not a real Christian, you know? But all this like external, I look at people and on the surface and by their externals, what they do, where they've come from, who they associate with, what their background is. I mean, they say they're a Christian, but anybody can say it, but they may not be because they go there, they do that, judging people based on external things. So here, what at first looks like a confrontation over eating with people, is it like, Peter's going to Chipotle and not Pancheros. Is that what this is, right? He's changed. No, it's actually about how someone is saved. It's actually about how someone has a relationship with God, what the gospel of Jesus Christ really is. And so Paul's watching this happen. He's watching Peter pull back. He's watching Peter compromise. Peter is fumbling this. And Paul is thinking to himself, look, I'm not going to make a big deal over every little thing, but this is no little thing. This is actually the thing, the main thing, the only thing that is of utmost importance. And so he looks at Peter and he says, Peter, why are you doing this? You're being a hypocrite. And I'm not afraid to let everybody else know that because what you've done is a public thing, a public denunciation of the gospel that you say you believe. And so Paul confronts Peter publicly because he stood condemned. Apparently, the true gospel does impact who we eat with and who we associate with and how we treat people. Notice how Paul goes on to say it in verse 14. He says, when I saw that they were not acting in line with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in front of them all, you're a Jew, yet you live like a Gentile and not like a Jew. How is it then that you force Gentiles to follow Jewish customs? In other words, what Paul is saying is like, Peter, come on, man. You didn't even follow all of the rules that you're now condemning the Gentiles for. And Paul is probably thinking back to and realizing that Peter, just a little while before this, had a vision that God gave him. This story is told in Acts, where God makes Peter go into a trance, and he shows him this vision multiple times where there is a sheet full of what Jews would have seen as unclean animals, and God says to him, eat the bacon. Have the pork, become an Iowan, maybe is what he was saying, right? Eat all of this meat. And Peter's like, no, I've never touched it. I won't do it. And God says, don't call anything unclean that I have called clean. And then he makes Peter go to a Gentile's house, what a good Jew would never do. And you wouldn't eat with a Gentile. And God says, I'm telling you to go there. And so I think Paul knows this. And he's like, Peter, God gave you this vision. He said these things to you. You know what the gospel is, and you've associated with Gentiles, so why are you now compromising on this? And why are you going to force Gentiles to do things that you don't even follow anymore? Paul's saying, Peter, you know this. You also know how people are saved. You know what the gospel is. You know that people have a relationship with God by faith in Jesus Christ, not by their works, and that's how you live. So why are you not treating Gentiles, get this, in line with that gospel? And it's such a big deal to Paul that he, as one apostle, would take on and confront another apostle and then write a letter and make sure it is in recorded history so that 2,000 years later, we would still be talking about it, right? Now, to be fair, this is Paul's perspective, and Peter, in the New Testament letters he wrote us, he never recounts this story for some reason. I don't know. Peter leaves it out. He doesn't give us his accounting. He's probably like, please, Paul, don't share that one. Just leave that one out. But Paul's like, no, people need to know about this. For thousands of years to come, they need to know what the gospel is and what the gospel line is. And that's what I think Paul is trying to show us here. What we see from Paul, especially here in verse number 14, is that there is the gospel itself. And the gospel itself is a truth. It is a reality. But from that gospel flow implications, corollaries. There are effects of that gospel. From the gospel flows a gospel line. Look at verse 14 again. It says it this way. When I saw they weren't acting in line with the truth of the gospel. So there's the gospel itself, and then there is a gospel line. The word in line there is the Greek word orthopodeo. Orthopodeo. Ortho. Does that sound familiar at all? Ortho, like orthodontist, orthopedic, orthodox. The word ortho just means straight. It means right. It means correct. So I have 5 kids, and our 3rd kid has started on braces. And for those of you that have really young children, just get ready for it. Because each kid is like $2,000 down and $200 a month for 2 years. So we're 5 years into our 10-year orthodontic plan, right? And we're about halfway there, and we're living on a prayer for this, like to pay off all of these things. Why do our kids get braces? It's obvious, to get their teeth in line so that their teeth, their jaws, and their mouths can be healthy, and also so that they can find a spouse that will marry them and then pay for all of these things so their dad can stop paying for all these things, right? No, it's ortho means in line. We want to get teeth in line. An orthopedic. Many of you have broken bones before, and you go to an orthopedic doctor, and if you go there, they might take an x-ray. If it's really bad, they might have to take an MRI. They might put you in a cast or in a boot. They might have you do physical therapy. And why do they do all of that? To get your bones back in line. For those of you that have if you've broken your femur before, you break your femur bone, which is supposed to be one of the worst pains in the world. Probably not worse than childbirth, I'm 100% sure. But you break your femur, right? And that doesn't just affect this part of your leg where the femur bone is at. Your whole body feels the pain, but also you're not going to have use of your knee or the bottom part of your leg or your feet or your toes. You've got to get that bone back in line to heal so that the rest of your leg and the rest of your body works. And so that is this word here. Getting the gospel right, knowing what the gospel is, and then from that gospel, a gospel line flows to everything we think and everything we say and everything we do. The decisions that we make and the passions flow from that gospel. So if this is true, and this is what Paul gets so worked up about, which, by the way, is his entire point of writing this gospel or this letter to the Galatian believers. We'll see a little bit more of that as we go through the series. He's writing this entire letter to the churches in Galatia to set them straight on, you know what the gospel is, now follow it. Follow the gospel line. And if that's true, we have to get clarity then about what the gospel actually is, and then talk about the implications that follow from it. The gospel and the gospel line. Does that make sense? You tracking with me this morning? Just so that I know that you're alive, just nod your head slightly or something like that. Okay, all right. So the gospel. What is the gospel? This is Paul's main concern in this letter, to clarify it, and then talk about how the true gospel was actually being perverted in the Galatian churches. So flip back over to chapter 1, and notice how he says this. In Galatians 1, verse 6, he says this. Now, he gives some greeting. We'll look at his greeting in just a minute, the first 5 verses. But it's a brief greeting, and then he is right into it. And this is one of the strongest things he says at the beginning of any of his letters. He says this in verse 6. I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you to live in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel, which is really no gospel at all. Evidently, some people are throwing you into confusion and trying to pervert the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach a gospel other than the one we preach to you, let them be under God's curse. As we have already said, so now I'm going to say it again. If anybody is preaching to you a gospel other than what you accepted from us, let them be under God's curse. That's really strong. Like, hey, how are you doing today? No, he's just like, I can't believe that you've abandoned the truth, the clarity about what the gospel of Jesus Christ is. And you notice in verse 6 that he contrasts this different gospel with what? What does he contrast it with? He contrasts it with the true gospel, which he describes here as living in the grace of Christ. For Paul, at least here in the book of Galatians, the simplest definition that he uses of what the gospel is the gospel is living in the grace of Jesus. Meaning that I am saved. I'm accepted by God. I'm in the family of God and I have a relationship with God, not by what I do or what I don't do, but because of the grace of Jesus. Because of what Jesus Christ has done and the grace he has given me. And what is it that Jesus did? We'll go back up to verse 1. Paul begins the letter this way. Paul, I'm an apostle, sent not from men nor by a man, but by Jesus Christ and God the Father, get this, who raised Jesus from the dead. So this is the gospel, the very beginning, right? Jesus Christ is a real person who lived a human life, who died, and who resurrected from the grave. That's the gospel. Notice how he says it in verse 3. Grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ, who gave himself for our sins to rescue us from the present evil age. Jesus died and resurrected as a substitute for us to rescue us from our sin and to bring us to God. Now look, there are many terms that are used to describe the gospel. There's a simple way to explain the gospel, and there's an expanded way to explain the gospel. And in the New Testament, there's different ways this is described. But the essence of the gospel for Paul in Galatians is this: living in the grace of Jesus who died and resurrected to rescue us. That's what he says. It's living in the grace of Jesus who died and resurrected to rescue us. Now, in this book, Paul is really focused on the grace part, because the false gospel that was being taught by the circumcision party, sometimes they're called the Judaizers, the false gospel they were teaching was that if you're really going to be a Christian, if you're really going to be saved and in with God, yes, it's Jesus, but it's Jesus plus you got to be circumcised. It's Jesus plus follow the Old Testament laws. It's Jesus plus all these ritual laws that we have. So it was like Jesus, yes, but it's also plus this. Otherwise, you're not good enough. And we can't be friends. And we're not going out to Pancheros together with each other because I can't associate with you because you're not good enough. And what Paul is trying to say here repeatedly is no, Jesus makes everyone good enough by his grace. We're in by his grace. Notice how he says it in chapter 2. So flip back over to chapter 2. In the context in which we were reading where the confrontation takes place, this is how Paul further describes it in verse 15. He says this: we who are Jews by birth, chapter 2, verse 15, we who are Jews by birth. So in other words, himself, Paul's a Jew by birth, and Peter is a Jew by birth, and these people that came from the Jerusalem church are Jews, and the Jews in the Galatian church that he's at Antioch. He says, we who are Jews by birth and not sinful Gentiles. See, sinful Gentiles with a quote around it, right? And not sinful Gentiles. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. So we too have put our faith in Jesus Christ that we may be justified by faith in Christ and not by the works of the law, because by the works of the law, no one can be justified. Justification is a big word that Paul uses to explain the gospel. You want to see more about justification? Read the entire book of Romans. That's what it's all about. We're actually going to start that series in January. But justification means to be declared righteous, to be made right with God by grace through faith in Jesus. You notice that in verse 15. How are we made right with God? What's the word? We're made right with God by faith in Jesus. We are saved by grace through faith, by the grace of Jesus through faith in Jesus. So get this. This means it is really great that all of you are here this morning. And for those of you that are awake, it's even better that you're here this morning. I'm kidding. Okay. It's great that you're here. And those of you that are watching online and those of you that will watch this later, that is really, really good. I'm so glad that you're here. We know that this is important that we're here. But you got to recognize something. You being here is not saving anybody. You're not earning credits with God by being here. There's not a reward system. This isn't Starbucks. It's not like if I go to church 6 times, then I get more favor with God. And if I do it twice before 11 a.m., I get double stars with God or something like that. There's not a reward system here. We're not earning favor with God by your attendance and by being here. Baptism is so awesome. It's wonderful to celebrate with Ron, to hear his story and to rejoice in new life and his faith in Jesus Christ. But you know something, baptism does not make you right with God. Communion, prayer, being kind, forgiving others. We just spent 2 months talking about forgiveness and how important forgiveness is, but your forgiveness of other people does not save you. Your giving, your generosity, your praying, all wonderful things that do nothing to make you right with God. Maybe like, Jeremy, but I was confirmed in the Lutheran church. But I was baptized a Presbyterian. But I grew up Baptist and I went to Sunday school and VBS and I know the hymns of the faith. I'm E-free. I did a missions trip. My whole family goes to church. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. Well, Jeremy, actually, that might be pretty good because I don't have any church background. None of my family believes. And I've actually done some really terrible things. I've done some criminal things. I hated God. I've made fun of Baptists before, right? I've wasted so much of my life. I've been really selfish with my life. We know that a person is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Jesus Christ. This is the one true gospel and the foundation of everything we believe. In the book of Ephesians, Paul will say it crystal clear for us when he says this: it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is the gift of God. It's not the result of works, so that no one can boast. Now look, church, it's vital that we get this down, that we hold on to this one true gospel so that we don't subtly do the Jesus plus thing. Yes, Jesus, but communion. Yes, Jesus, but baptism. Yes, Jesus, but confirmation. Yes, Jesus, but also I have to do these things. No, it's not Jesus plus I need to be better. Not Jesus, but probably not for me because of how bad I've been. Yes, but not for that person because they're really, really bad. No, we're all in by grace through faith. Are you? Are you? Have you trusted simply in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ for you plus nothing else? Like if you're here today, no, God longs to justify you. Why else would he send Jesus to us? Why would he give us this word? Why would he keep teaching us and keep bringing us this truth over and over again, inviting us into his family, into relationship with him, not on the basis of your good works and how awesome you are and in spite of how bad you are, but because of what Jesus Christ has done. He wants to free you. He wants to forgive you. He wants to relieve your guilt and shame, to give you peace and hope in him. Trust him by grace through faith. And then once you come to this place, I believe the gospel, the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ for me, know that there is a line that flows from that gospel affecting everything else, affecting the entire rest of your life. Orthodox. Ortho, living in line with the gospel in everything I think, in everything I say, in everything I do. My passions, my commitments flowing from the grace of Jesus. That's the gospel line. This means that the gospel is not just something we say we believe. We do believe it, but it's not just something that we assent to, that we say, yeah, I agree with that thing. It's not just a part of our Sunday experience alone. It's not a convenience to get around to, or something that we need to address at some point in our lives when we get a little bit less busy, and then I will give attention to that gospel thing and that relationship with God. Now look, I know that all of you are busy. Did any of you miss the deadline to get your outside stuff done before it's freezing cold, right? Are you like this when it comes to the fall? Like, how many more days of warmth do I have left? Christmas lights! I gotta get the Christmas lights up. And I haven't done it yet, but I think it's gonna be 60 degrees next week. But that's on my mind. Like, okay, I gotta get that done, and the grass thing's done, and I gotta clean that up, and I gotta get that furniture inside and get the garage the way that it needs to be so we can park in the garage for the winter, and we got bills to pay, and we got kids to take care of, and we got orthodontics bills to pay, and we got, like, you have a lot of things. There are a lot of things for us to do in our lives. But then there's the thing. And this, the gospel, and the gospel line is the thing. It's why Paul is so adamant about it and willing to take on another apostle, because it's everything. The gospel of grace, which creates in us a gospel line, effects, corollaries, implications. In Galatians, Paul shows us that it affects who we eat with. It affects how we see people and who we associate with, and how we talk, and how we work, and how we view social issues. So what we're going to do over the next 6 weeks in this series is explore the gospel line. Today we're trying to make sure that the gospel is clear, and in the next 6 weeks we'll look at the gospel line. Some of the things that the gospel affects. Now, there's many more than this, but we picked out these mostly from the book of Galatians, and here's the gospel line issues we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about justice. That's the immediate context of what's going on here as Paul discriminates against a group of people because he thinks he's doing, well, he doesn't even think he's doing what's right. He's afraid of others. And so we'll talk about that next week. We're going to talk about adoption. We host here at the church the Hope Adoption Conference. That'll happen in a couple weekends, and on that Sunday we'll talk about adoption. That's in Galatians chapter 4. We're going to talk about disability in the church. How should the church view disability? How should we think about that? Did you know that Paul had a disability? He talks about it in the book of Galatians and their response to him in dealing with his disability that he had. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. And then we're going to talk about growth as a follower of Jesus and gratitude and generosity. Now you notice that some of these are issues and some of them are like character qualities. And the gospel wants to affect, like I said, everything. So it affects the way we view things, the way we view issues, and affects things that are going on in our lives as well. The gospel and the gospel line. Now one more thing I want to point out about this gospel and the gospel line is that both distinction and connection are really important. Why is distinguishing between the gospel and the effects of the gospel, why is that so important? Well, if I don't distinguish between the gospel, and I'm clear on that, and the gospel line, then everything becomes the gospel. And the gospel loses its essential meaning then. It's kind of like the word literally. You've had people say this, right? I literally died. No, actually you literally did not die because you are speaking to me right now, right? And you know this, the word literally has lost its meaning. I've used it wrong. I know I've done it too, right? I've used the word literally wrong. So we've used it for so many things that now it's lost what it actually means. Maybe when you're a little kid and you're going to get ice cream, you're like, which one do you want? Well, and they say, everything is my favorite. Not technically true, right? Now, ice cream might be your favorite, but ice cream has a lot of flavors, so every flavor of ice cream can't be your favorite or you don't have a favorite. The word loses its meaning. Some of you are at jobs and in your workplace, and you start off the year, you're like, we have 10 top priorities this year. Oh, that drives me crazy. You can't have 10 top priorities. Words are losing their meaning because top and priority means like 2 or 3 maybe. You can't have 10 top priorities. Otherwise, you don't have any priorities. Really, it dilutes the meaning of those very words. This is what I'm saying. When everything is the gospel, then nothing is. And we've lost the gospel. Let me get very specific. Hear me carefully. When we start talking and thinking that donating to a food pantry is the gospel, or supporting a compassion child like many of you do, that's the gospel, or doing justice work is the gospel, or fostering kids is the gospel, or giving money to missions is the gospel, or just being kind and loving to people is the gospel, we're on the first step to losing what the gospel actually is. None of those things are the gospel. And the gospel is not subscribing to a certain political view. And it's not following certain rules, and it's not doing or not doing certain things. You know what the gospel is? The gospel is the historical reality about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. It is news. It is the good news. And as Tim Keller has reminded us, the gospel is not good advice about how to get your life better. The gospel is good news. News is proclaimed. It is declared. It is the reality that is shared, and it calls for faith in that reality of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, so that people can believe in him and live in his grace. None of those activities I mentioned are the gospel, and you don't want them to be the gospel. Because think about what it means if we start subtly thinking, well, fostering kids, well, being a generous person, just loving my neighbors, giving money to those that are in need, doing justice work. If I start thinking that's the gospel, let me ask you the question. How much of that do you need to do to be in with God? How many kids do you need to foster? How much money do you need to give? How good do you need to be in order to be accepted before God? In order to make it in order for God to be happy with you, in order for you to be saved? So do you see why I say when everything becomes the gospel, then really nothing is? It dilutes and it perverts the gospel. When we do that, we dilute it, we add to it, we distort it. And we begin to add burdens to ourselves and to others about how you better do this and you better not do that. You might find yourself being where these Galatian Christians are these Jews. Well, you got to be circumcised. Probably nobody's in danger of that one. But that's what was happening in this church, right? No, it's Jesus, but you also have to do this. You have to have this mark that we have. That's our national identity. And if you don't do that, you're not really a Christian. NorthPoint, we're not going to fall prey to this. Let's not go that direction. Let's be clear and distinct on what the gospel is. It is not Jesus plus. It is faith in the death and the resurrection of Jesus Christ alone. Salvation by grace through faith alone in Jesus. Now, if you've been at NorthPoint for any time, you know that all of those things that I mentioned, we believe are really important gospel line issues. Right? Some of you are maybe a little bit nervous, and you're still a little bit nervous with me. You're like, oh my goodness, are you saying we don't care about fostering kids anymore, and we don't care about I can stop supporting my compassion kid, and that's not important, and we shouldn't do justice work or care about those things? I didn't say none of those things are good. I just said they're not the gospel. But get this, they are a clear implication of the gospel. They are a clear effect of the gospel. There is a gospel line to each of those things. And that's the connection piece. Distinction is important so that we're clear on what the gospel is, but connection is just as important. Martin Luther is credited with saying this: faith alone saves, but faith that saves is never alone. It is faith in Jesus Christ alone that brings us into a relationship with God, but a genuine faith in Jesus will transform the person. It will change you and affect everything about you. So that faith can't be alone. It's a powerful, strong faith in Jesus Christ. John the Baptist, when he was getting ready for Jesus to come, and he's announcing the coming of the Messiah, he said this: bring forth fruit in keeping with repentance. In other words, if you've genuinely turned from yourself and you've turned to God with faith in him, it's going to produce fruit and change in your life. James, who wrote the book of James in the New Testament, said it this way: faith without works is dead. Faith that's just like, oh yeah, I believe those things, but has no effect or change in your life is not a genuine faith in Jesus Christ, because a genuine faith in Jesus Christ will produce things. It will change things about you. Notice how Paul says it in Galatians chapter 5 in verse 6. When he gets to the summary of this whole argument about do Gentiles have to be circumcised or not, you can tell he's getting a little bit frustrated. And so he says this in Galatians 5 and verse 6. He says, for in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision has any value. The only thing that counts is faith, expressing itself through love. Faith in Jesus that results in love. Faith in Jesus and that gospel line producing a tremendous effect in our lives. There is a gospel line. The gospel that saves us is the gospel that transforms everything about us. It's just not produced by our effort alone. In an attempt for us to get right with God, we are right with God through the gospel. And once that reality comes to bear in our lives, it changes everything because Jesus changes everything. The gospel and the gospel line. So my daughters, these many daughters I have, means that I have seen many Disney and princess movies in my life. A number of our girls enjoy Star Wars and the Marvel movies. In fact, our youngest one was like, Dad, I want to watch X-Men 2. I was like, all right on with that. So she watched that yesterday. And of course, their mom is a big Rocky fan, and so she likes to watch anything Sylvester Stallone's in. You know, I've told you before because of our resemblance, but especially in the early years, like lots of princess movies with the girls. One of these movies that we watch is The Princess Diaries. You watched Princess Diaries before? So it tells the story of this like dorky, awkward teenage girl with very few friends who ends up finding out that she is an heir to a European throne. And so the story follows along with her going from this like very bland, awkward existence to a life of luxury and thrills and challenges and all sorts of new realities for her. This is one of Anne Hathaway's early films, and she plays the main character, Mia Thermopolis, and she has to decide, am I going to embrace my new identity and take up the responsibility of the throne, or am I going to go back to my old existence? And for her, there's really no in-between. She realizes that to embrace this new identity as a princess has profound implications for the rest of her life. You might say there's a princess line for her. Once she embraces and takes on this identity as princess and finds herself in that identity, it means all of these things. When we believe the gospel of Jesus Christ and receive his grace, we receive a new identity by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And there's a line that flows from that identity of being found in Jesus Christ because he means to have all of us and change everything about us. That's his gospel line. And that's what we want to explore in this series, the gospel and the gospel line. So let me finish up with this. What I want to encourage you to do as we get ready and get prepared, if you want to get the most out of this series, 3 things I want to encourage you to do here over the next, we'll do another 6 weeks in this series, is to read the book of Galatians. And a couple of resources for that, you go back to Acts chapter 13 to 15, tells the narrative story of how these churches got started and planted. I've mentioned the Bible Project to you before. If you Google Bible Project Galatians, the first hit that will come up is an overview video of the book of Galatians to get you more familiar with it. So read the book of Galatians, maybe check out those resources. Secondly, I want to encourage us to rejoice in the gospel. Do you know that in large part, the thing that we're trying to do every single Sunday when we come here to worship together is to do that second point? We're trying to see God, see the grace of Jesus Christ, and rest in it, and rejoice in it, and hope in it. That I come into this place, regardless of the week that I've had, and I can find forgiveness and redemption and renewal, not for what I've done. I'm not trying to earn my stars. I'm not trying to make God more happy with me by my performance. I'm resting in what Jesus Christ has done and then trusting that grace to change me and to renew me. Rejoice in the gospel, the hope and the life and the freedom that Jesus Christ has given you because of what Jesus has done. And then thirdly, in this series, we're going to really reflect on the gospel line. And so you could maybe start thinking about that in your life as you think about, have I believed and trusted in the gospel as it's described here by Paul? By grace through faith, I'm in with God and have a relationship with him. And then you could start thinking about, has this had an effect like from my head to my heart to my actions? Am I living in line with the gospel? You know, like if Paul saw me, would it be like, hey, you're not living in line with the gospel? And so you can just start before God, say, God, help me to see, am I living in that gospel line? Am I yielding to you with my passions, with my values, with my time? Am I thinking the way you want me to think? Allow Jesus to shape everything about you, not to earn his grace, but because he has granted you his grace. Would you pray with me?